Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our in-person audience. Welcome to our online audience, which I'm pleased to see is already asking questions. This event coincides with the publication this morning of a third paper in our series on Friendshoring the lithium-ion battery supply chain. The third paper is on final assembly and end uses. The previous paper, the first one examined the technical steps and policy challenges involved in processing and defining critical minerals and raw materials in a battery. And the second one described the use of these minerals and materials to create cathode and anode active battery materials and other components. The third paper looks at the supply chain and concludes with some recommendations, particularly in the trade policy area, because that's what the Scholl Chair in International Business does, about how to move forward. Overall, I think the theme of these papers has been that the administration is trying to pursue three goals at the same time, which are not all compatible. They're focused on reshoring American manufacturing, on de-risking from China, and on accelerating the transition to green technologies, of which batteries are an integral part. We believe that it's not easy to do all of those at the same time. That if you pursue the reshoring in particular, you do that at the sacrifice of accelerating the green transition. If you accelerate the transition to green by being batteries, that means doing a lot more business with China, which gets into the way of your de-risking and reshoring goals. We concluded that the best way to proceed is essentially with a nearshoring model that relies not just on the United States for production, but on partnerships, trusted partnerships with friends and allies to build battery supply chains that are resilient and secure and efficient. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. First, we are honored to have with us Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma. Senator Lankford was served in the House for 4 years and then was elected senator in 2014, so he's now well into his second term. Prior to his service in Congress, he served students and families for more than 20 years in ministry, including 15 years as the director of student ministry for the Baptist Convention of Oklahoma and director of the Falls Creek Youth Camp, which is the largest youth camp in the United States with more than 51,000 individuals attending each summer, which must be a huge management task. In any event, it's a pleasure to have him here. He's on the right committees in Congress to deal with this issue. He serves on the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade and tax issues, as you all know, as well as on the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee and the Intelligence Committee, as well as the Ethics Committee. So he's got a lot of background in relevant areas. And as we'll see in our discussion after he finishes talking, he's has been active in the critical minerals area as well. Following the senator, we're going to have a panel of experts that I will introduce at that time that will delve into our paper in greater detail. But for the time being, let me start by offering the senator the podium, and then we'll have an armchair conversation after that.
Bill, thank you for the kind introduction on that. I'm sure it makes everyone a little nervous that a former youth pastor is up here talking about international critical minerals as well. And depending on your relationship with previous youth pastors in your past, it really is an honor to be able to be here and to be able to be as a part of the dialogue. Let me just walk through a couple of things and start with the most basic of elements. Critical means critical. So you have to have it. It means it's essential. So you got to determine what you're going to do to get that accomplished. A friend of mine we've been friends for decades had a heart transplant last week. He waited 8 weeks in a hospital, waiting, pausing, honestly, for someone else to die so that their heart would be then donated to him. Why do I say that? Because the heart's critical. His body's not going to function without it. It's essential that it's a part of that. And so he laid in a hospital bed waiting for that essential part. We as a nation understand there are certain things that we have to have. We have to provide our own food or we can't function. We have to provide our own energy or we're always vulnerable. If you can't provide your own food and you can't provide your own energy, you're always at risk from someone outside of your country than controlling you for the most basic, essential, I dare say, critical aspects of your economy and of daily life and operation. When we get into energy production, we're at a stage as a country that we have a voracious appetite for more energy. It continues to be able to drive the world's largest economy and continues to be able to drive innovation that's there. We need all forms of energy, and I know everyone looks at me and says, you're from Oklahoma, I know what you're thinking on energy, but Oklahoma is actually one of the most, if not the most, diverse energy producing states in America. Oil, gas, wind, solar, hydroelectric. I dare put Oklahoma's energy portfolio next to any state in America, especially the Northeast states that brag all the time about what needs to be done, and I smile at their portfolio and compare it to mine in Oklahoma. We're not afraid in Oklahoma to be able to research every type of energy and understand every type of energy will be essential, but when we get into electric, there are some basic questions that come up very quickly. First of all, where do those critical minerals come from? Not just where do they come from, where are they processed, and how do we make sure if we become dependent on that particular form of energy, we're not exposing our national security at the same time? We as a nation understood full well in the 1970s what happens when we are energy exposed, and we never want to get to that moment again where we have a risk of operating in any day at any time and saying another country can control the world's largest economy and what the world sees as a critical aspect of national defense and international defense. If that can be controlled by another foreign entity based on energy, we are always at risk. We can't get to that point again. So what do you do in a day of electrification, and how do you actually engage? Well, the most obvious issues are we produce a lot here. There are critical minerals and rare earth minerals here in the United States. We should find ways to be able to deal with the permitting issues here to be able to resolve those. Right now, it takes between 7 and 20 years to be able to permit a mine for critical minerals in the United States. 7 to 20 years. I dare say most investors that have $1.5 billion or so laying around in their couch to be able to actually do investing are not going to invest $1.5 billion in a project that may get a return 20 years from now if it can get permitted. They'll take that capital and they'll invest it somewhere else. So it makes it very difficult for us to be able to do investment here. Our friends in Canada have figured this issue out. They've determined there are ways to be able to have very strict timelines to be able to go through the process for permitting. We need to be more serious about dealing with the permitting issues here, the litigation issues here, so that everyone has an opportunity to be able to speak into the issues. But we also have clear timelines of when we're going to make a decision, whether we're going to do the project or not. Not every project that we start, we're going to finish. There's some we're going to determine, you know what, this is not appropriate for the environment, for the community, for whatever it may be, and it can come to a close. But if it is going to move forward, we need to have a determination when that's actually going to occur. We have to deal with issues about how we're going to process. One of the most straightforward solutions that's out there on processing is taking existing brownfield sites that currently exist within the United States and actually doing processing in those same locations. The area around it is already used to what has happened in the past in that. There's already a perimeter that's set up in some of those areas. And while remediation can happen from one previous operation that's there, we can have a second operation that's in that same spot that's also doing processing, which we all know is not the cleanest of all possible things that can be done. So how do we manage that? If it's going to happen somewhere in the world, how do we do it here in the United States to make sure it's done the cleanest it can possibly be done, rather than offshoring what we consider quote unquote dirty and all pretending we don't live on the same planet? So let's find a way to be able to make sure that it's done as clean as it can possibly be done. That is actually doing it here in the United States. And second with that, it's doing it alongside friends. There are friends all over the world that we have consistent allied relationships with, that we know that we can cooperate together to be able to actually provide energy in a way that we know that they're not going to expose us one day to a leverage point and to say, we'll only give you your lithium if. When we're dealing with China, at any given day, they could say, we're not going to provide lithium anymore if. That's a dangerous proposition for us in our own future and our own investment and the commitments that we make to each other and to other nations. I proposed several things. One of them is the Quad relationship that's out there. That Quad relationship between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States to form a partnership together on how we're going to actually determine the mining and the processing of much of this lithium, these rare earths and critical minerals that we need to be able to have, and that next step of processing. It's also dealing with the permitting issues as I've dealt with here, because some of those things will be mined other places and processed here, or they may be mined in Australia and processed in India. There are lots of different ways that we can actually partner together to be able to do it, but to have a trusted set of partnerships and relationships becomes essential for us to be able to determine the direction that we're going to go in the days ahead. While we're dealing with the cathode side of the production, which seems to be the buzzword part of the conversation, is how we're going to deal with the lithium, magnesium, and the nickel, and all the things that we've got to be able to have on the cathode side. We can't forget the anode side of this for the production as well. That's a carbon-based piece that's actually there that we have also outsourced to China, and we're very exposed to that. Now, again, China is a trade partner. We're continuing to be able to trade, but we should be wise in that trade relationship as well, that as we're trading with them, that we're not putting ourselves in a vulnerable position where then they have leverage and control over the United States and hence the rest of the world. We should increase our trade with other nations outside of even the Quad to be able to develop the ongoing relationships that we're going to need for the days ahead to continue to build a world economy around clean energy options in this. And I would say with that, we should continue to develop trade relationships. This has been a frustration that I've had with the Biden administration, and this is not a partisan conversation, just a conversation. For whatever reason, in the last 3.5 years, the Biden administration has not advanced trade negotiations. They're not forming long-term relationships. They're tweaking existing relationships. One of the things that we need in this day and age is to lean forward and continue to find new ways to establish long-term trade partnerships. Those are not executive agreements. Executive agreements rise and fall at the end of each administration. We don't need executive agreements on trade. We need lasting agreements that people can count on, that people can invest on, that companies are not afraid to put capital towards because they know they're going to extend past 4 years or 5 years. They know they're going to be there in some form because there's been an agreement made that Congress has affirmed and that we're moving forward. That's going to be essential for us in the future for all of our production. Now, Oklahoma is one of many states that's actually doing battery production. We've done battery recycling for EV batteries now for over a decade in Oklahoma. We're engaged in this space as we're engaged in lots of other clean energy and all forms of energy for production for the country because we need it. But while we're in this dialogue, we need to realize that this is not something that can just wait on the long-term horizon. We've got to actually put things in place right now to be able to move us towards that future because our energy needs demand it. So let me open this up for a conversation. I think you and I are going to have a dialogue, Bill. You're going to play Stump the Senator for a while, and we'll get a chance to be able to sit and visit a little bit about where we go from here.
Well, you've answered most of my questions already.
Well, thank you. Good night.
Well,
Yeah.
so I'm going to ask some of them again, and maybe we can get into a little bit more depth on some of them. I think you've made the point about China, I think, eloquently. I think the point of our paper was if we're going to reduce our dependence on the People's Republic, and if we're going to avoid economic coercion, which you alluded to, then we need to focus on, as the administration is attempting to do, scaling up our homegrown capabilities and also cooperating with allies and partners, kind of a balancing act, because if you do that, then you slow down some of the transition, which is already, as you pointed out, and we'll get to this in a minute, on the permitting issue, going pretty slowly. Do you think, how's the balancing act going? Do you think the administration is doing it the right way? What should they be doing that's different on all those different fronts?
So a couple of things on it. We've got to deal with the permitting issues here as we continue to deal with how are decisions made, when are decisions made. That deals with things that they don't want to talk about, quite frankly, that are tough. It's things like litigation. how do you handle litigation? You can't do permitting for mines for processing without also dealing with what are the deadlines for litigation, what's the appropriateness, who can actually file it, do you do those consecutive, do you do those all at one time? This is where I mentioned the Canadians, that they've done a lot of work on this to be able to determine, hey, we want people to be able to speak into it. This is your neighborhood, your community. You have the right to be able to do that, but we also have timelines for when that can actually be done. It creates a more predictable environment. So if someone's going to do investment, that's an area that they should be leaning into more. And I think they have a concern that they're not going to step on some of the activists in that area that want to have protracted litigation to be able to slow the process down. And by the way, that's not just for lithium and processing. That would be things like hydrogen. There's a lot of conversation about a hydrogen future as well. You can't have hydrogen without pipelines, and you can't have pipelines without permitting. And so all of those things have become connected.
Yeah, one of the things we've commented on many times in the Scholl chair is, this is America. Anybody can sue anybody for anything.
Right.
And that's sort of part of, not the greatest part of our culture. The paper that we posted this morning refers to a GAO study that looked at this issue and concluded that the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle was insufficient funds and insufficient staff amongst permitting authorities, including EPA. I guess, A, do you agree with that? And B, are you going to support more money?
I would not say it's insufficient staff count in EPA. I would say it's insufficient staff count in the right office in EPA. There are some offices that apparently don't have enough to do, and so they seem to be fiddling in everyone's business all the time on it. And I constantly get challenges back from my farmers and ranchers and from other folks that are talking about the new regulation that's coming out from EPA. And so I think EPA, the challenge is always setting a priority and saying, how do we make sure that we're getting the maximum amount that we can to be able to actually get the maximum production and quality for our life that we can. So I would first look at EPA and talk about where their manpower is dedicated rather than just say I'm going to add more to it.
Okay, well, I don't know the administration has proposed any more, but we'll see. I think you make a good point about the length of time it takes to get anything done. The number we've been using is right in the middle of the estimate, the range that you provided, that it was the average from a mining operation was 16 years, right, from discovery of the product, whatever it is, to production, which is a very long time and longer than most places. Let's talk for a minute about well, let's first talk about minerals. You talked about the critical minerals, the Quad Critical Minerals Partnership Act. How do you, what's your view on other critical minerals agreements? We have one with Japan. Right. We have a number of countries that have expressed interest, Indonesia, the Philippines, the EU, which has been under negotiation for some time. I think the UK has raised the issue. Should we be pursuing those more actively? What's the problem? And are those the right countries?
I would say what other country has critical minerals and is willing to have a long-term relationship with the United States? It's a friendly relationship. Friendshoring is called friendshoring for a reason, because we're actually friends and we're going to engage in other areas in addition to just that critical minerals point of it. Those are helpful relationships. So whether that is in Africa, whether it's in the Western Hemisphere, whether it's in Asia, I think we look for those moments. I don't think we can lock in on just lithium, for instance, and you're not saying this. Magnesium, cobalt, nickel. I mean, there's so many different minerals that are out there, some rare, some not rare, all those critical in the production. Those are relationships that we've got to have, but they're also minerals that we have here in the United States. We're in a better position when we're doing some of the production here and developing relationships to go above and beyond what we need in other places. For now, in the transition, as you've mentioned often, we're going to have to receive in from other places and then set targets. How much do we want to actually mine and produce and process here, and how much are we going to do internationally? And for that amount internationally, where's that going to come from? That's a strategic plan. How much nickel do we need to get from here? We have lithium that's in Nevada, large deposits in Nevada. We have nickel in, lithium that's in North Carolina. We have lithium that's in the water in eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas. Lithium is located here. We've just got to be able to actually have the process to be able to actually go get it and produce it. But first things first, what are we trying to get here? What are we trying to get in other places? What's our percentage to get other places?
Yeah, do you, it's, as you mentioned in your own comments, it's a dirty process.
Yes.
Do you have a NIMBY problem here?
We do. That's why I recommend going to brownfield sites where there's already been a NIMBY fight already there. There are brownfield locations all around the country where there's been industrial production for a long time, where that community is used to that kind of action that's either far from town, in a remote area, in a rural area, or in a section that's an industrial area that there's used to production. If you're putting those locations in a former site that is now closed down, that part of the business is out of business, and it's just closed, that site can then be transitioned into processing for critical minerals, and it allows a familiar location to fight off that NIMBY issue.
Some of the countries that have, or entities that have expressed interest in an agreement, the EU in particular, the UK, are not well known as having large deposits of the minerals we're talking about. They discovered a lithium deposit in Sweden, but when you talk to their representatives, they seem to be much more interested in capturing the processing end and obtaining the minerals from other sources. Do you see that as an appropriate kind of nearshoring solution as well?
I think we're going to need all of it because the need is so immediate, and the lack of ability to produce it domestically is a decade or more away to get to any kind of quantities that we need. We're going to have to friendshore for quite a while, and that's once you actually build a location in one spot, they start to produce and they can make it economical. It's also difficult to then match that here and to say, well, no, we're going to do it ourselves. We can talk to our friends in Taiwan about all of the chip production, and that we've been dependent on them for a while because they're very efficient at doing it, and large quantities are coming in the United States. For us to be able to do it ourselves is a very expensive proposition to rise up. So once we friendshore this, and processing is other places, especially for the processing, that becomes difficult to then say 20 years from now we're going to just start it up our own. So whatever relationships we establish in the processing, we better really be friends because in all likelihood that will remain for a very long time.
Yeah, our impression has been that the countries that have the resources are increasingly interested in capturing as much of the value added in the process as they can, and they just don't want to be an extractive economy. They want They want to do not only the processing, but they also want to get into the initial piece of manufacturing part of it as well.
Right.
But you're comfortable with that kind of a relationship?
I am comfortable with that relationship. We have long-term conversations about what that relationship looks like. Not immediate about one particular product. It has to be broader than that in our trade relationships. When we're trading with them food, when we're trading with them textiles, when we're trading with them in other ways and engaged that are outside of the energy space alone, it creates a reciprocal relationship in trade. When you have a reciprocal relationship in trade, you need each other and you work on that relationship. When it's one product or one thing, we need them and they have leverage.
One of the mysteries in this is that we did one agreement very quickly with Japan, and the EU negotiation has been going on now. I think it's in its second year, and we haven't picked up on other hints from other countries that they're interested. Why aren't we making any progress on the other agreements? Do you have any
Why aren't
clue?
we making trade progress right now at all? The last 3.5 years, we've not made trade progress, and it's been very, very frustrating. Catherine Tai made a comment last week in a conference issues with the Atlantic Council, say we need to think about trade in a new way. I'd like for us to just think about trade at all. That would be helpful because we need to advance not just executive agreements that are short term. No one invests multi-billion dollars into production, mining, extraction, all that processing on something that's going to be a 3-year agreement. We've got to have long-term agreements.
Yeah, I've had, we do a podcast, The Trade Guys, commercial out there, and we've had, my colleague and I have had several rants about our trade policy. I won't afflict you with one of those now, but I can't help but observe that the Congress hasn't done much either in this area. You passed the Taiwan bill, which was an assertion of congressional authority, but there's a number of smaller things that have gone wanting and bigger things that haven't happened at all. I mean, this is an election year, so I don't think anybody's expecting drama. Well, they're expecting drama. I'm
It's
not
drama,
sure that.
yeah. You should only expect drama.
Yeah, they're expecting drama and not results.
Yeah.
But what's your longer term forecast for congressional trade action? Is this something that they're going to come back to?
Well, so obviously we've got get Trade Promotion Authority renewed again. That's languishing. That's not been even requested by the White House. So we've got to be able to engage with that. We've also got to deal with what FTAs we're going to work on. Typically, the administration would be the lead point on the negotiation on that to be able to drive that for that free trade agreement. None of those are actually moving at this point. The next key thing for us is trying to do individual products. That's just slower. And it doesn't open up to wider relationships. Our relationships with both Canada and Mexico is a long-standing relationship that we have renewed in the last 5 years. Our relationship with Central America and all the trade is something that's locked in because we know the CAFTA agreement, we know the parameters of that. We can go on and on multiple countries, but from an ag state like mine in Oklahoma, every ag producer asks me the same question: when is the next trade deal coming? Because we want to continue to be able to put products worldwide, but that's also a stabilizing point when it's not just the critical mineral or not just one piece, it's a broader agreement.
Yeah, I had expected, particularly from the farm community, my father-in-law was a farmer, so I got a boatload of advice from him over the years.
For all of us that like to eat, we like our farmers too, so yeah.
Well, yes, he'd give us a quarter beef every year for Christmas. It was a wonderful gift. I'm surprised. I've been expecting, frankly, that for the Congress to make more of a fuss about that than it has. There've been a couple hearings, but I mean, there's things that you can do unilaterally. I mean, you can take up TPA if you want to. I mean, I probably wouldn't get very far without the administration's support.
Right.
But on the other hand, if people are unhappy, one of the things Congress does very well is make a fuss, and there hasn't been much of that.
Frustration, but not a fuss. Quite frankly, we had other areas that we tried to be able to focus in on, but I would tell you in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, there were quite a few hearings during that time period talking about where's the FTA coming up. For instance, the agreements with just the UK. That should be low-hanging fruit as they pull out of the EU. They immediately reached out to the United States and said, you should be one of our first partners in getting a trade relationship. The Winston Churchill special relationship that we have with the UK still exists and is thriving on it. That's languishing. There's been no work to be able to strengthen that and to be able to formalize that kind of trade agreement. So there's low-hanging fruit that's out there that just needs to be done.
We've got a couple of minutes left before the senator has to leave. Do we have questions for the online audience? Please, if you have a question, stand up, raise your hand. The microphone will come to you. Tell us who you are and ask a question. Over here. I can't see very well, so because of the lights.
I'm loud enough anyway. Senator Boomer Sooner.
Boomer Sooner, national championships in softball again. So that's a four-peat for everyone who's keeping record.
No state commercials here. Go.
So the question is, permitting reform, okay? We've talked about my project in Railroad Valley, Nevada. We've got 120 million tons of lithium out there, right? So we've been waiting 26 months for our next exploration permit. It seems like every time you clear, like we clear all the cultural, biological, there's nobody who lives there, there's nobody around it. And then another roadblock comes up and people like us have no recourse. What do? Do you sue? I mean, then they throw up, mineral exam, right? 15 years. So what's the prospect for permitting reform? I had dinner with Senator Manchin maybe 2 years ago.
Right.
And we talked about this. What do you think the prospects are for that?
For the next 4 months, they're pretty low. And that's frustrating to be able to say. There's been a lot of dialogue, but not a lot of progress in this area. This is something that Senator Barrasso and Senator Manchin have been pretty passionate about, trying to resolve. Shelley Capito as well. Those are key committees of jurisdiction to try to resolve the permitting, because permitting is not just in one area, and that's been the challenge. My conversation on permitting is you can't fix part of it, you have to fix all of it. Because if there's any one portion that's unaddressed, that becomes the portion of conflict that holds you up 15 years. So you can't just deal with one section, and that's been the challenge, is that people say, sure, I'll deal with these 3 things, but those 12 things I want to leave alone. Well, it doesn't work that way. You've got to be able to resolve it all. That's why early on, there have been several hearings dealing with the Canadian model, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, to say, how do you do permitting? How do you provide that predictability? How do you actually pull all agencies together so there's a central agency making a decision? When there's one federal entity that just says they're not going to answer the question, as you've experienced, then what do you do in that? Who has the authority to be able to step in and say, no, you're going to answer the question? Well, the White House does. Congress can complain about that, but the White House has the authority to be able to step in and do it, but they need to have an overseer of that process to make sure there's the predictable timelines and the timelines are actually being met. And when someone has a question, they know who to be able to go to and say, that's the lead agency that's going to make sure other people are answering it. And quite frankly, you don't have 10 different applications that basically say the exact same thing for all 10 of them, that you have one that actually goes to 10 different agencies. Those are all achievable things, but it takes OIRA and the Office of Management and Budget to actually pull together and demand that process internally. It takes Congress to be able to put those parameters on and require it. And until we can get that, we're still going to be frustrated and talking about what could be. So thanks for pressing on it, because the nation needs it.
And we have a representative of the Canadian government on the panel
I've
following
done
this,
3
and-
commercials for him already.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, he'll take all the credit.
I've
once-
done everything but stand up and sing "Oh Canada" at this point. So yeah.
I think we'll forego that. Another question? We have time probably for one more here in the front row.
Hi, my name is Jacob Victoria. I'm an incoming sophomore at Yale. And my question for you, Senator, is in certain states such as California, which is my home state, where there is certain laws that are making electric vehicles required and maybe soon to follow other states around the country, how will the stagnation in getting lithium also be met with that high need and high demand in certain states such as California?
Well, this is not going to be a California commercial on it. The frustration that we have is it's one thing to be able to put a requirement down. It's another thing to have the physical capabilities to achieve that. You can say we're going to require every vehicle is going to be electric by a certain time. We're not going to sell any other vehicles. Well, that's good news for all the auto dealers that are in Arizona and Nevada and Oregon and every border state, because people are going to still go buy those vehicles there and then to be able to come back to California, because we don't have the capability to be able to reach those thresholds in the time period that's actually laid out. You can't wave a magic wand and say we're going to have enough lithium and enough nickel and enough production to be able to meet all the needs. Oh, and by the way, at the same time, we're also going to put huge tariffs on the Chinese at the same time, so we can't get them from the Chinese, or they'll be incredibly expensive to come in from the Chinese. At the same time, we don't have the production capability here. So those two have got to match, and currently they don't match, and you can't wave a magic wand and count on that it will be there. What California has done in the past is put down a demand, put the pressure on everybody, and then when it gets close, they'll delay it out, and they'll delay it out again to try to put pressure on the rest of the country to achieve what they're wanting to achieve. I think a lot of Americans are very open to electric vehicles. I have no issue with electric. I don't own one, but I have no issue with an electric vehicle. That doesn't bother me if people choose to be able to do that. But to be able to put the demand when it actually puts us in a vulnerable position internationally faster than what we can actually produce or we can friendshore puts us at a greater risk internationally.
Well, we've kept you longer than we promised to keep you, for which I apologize, but I want to thank you for your enlightenment and your comments, and you got us off to a great start.
Great.
And we'll say goodbye to the senator, and applause, please.
Yeah, thank y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
he served, among other places, in Canada's mission to the EU, as well as their mission to the WTO. We can share stories about that. I'd be interested in your views on the WTO. Chaired the WTO's Committee on Government Procurement from 2019 to 2021. And we're delighted to have you here, Carlos, particularly because we spent so much time talking about Canada already. Rory Heslington, who is next here, is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Autos Drive America, where he heads the association's legislative and policy agenda on a range of issues impacting the automotive manufacturing industry. Autos Drive America is the association of foreign automobile manufacturers. He previously served as international trade advisor to the Senate Finance Committee under then Chairman Chuck Grassley, and that makes him a trade guy officially. And we're delighted to have Rory with us as well. And last but certainly not least is Vanessa Sheriff, who is the Vice President for Trade and International Competitiveness at the American Clean Power Association, where she leads work on all aspects of trade policy as it affects renewables. Before joining the ACP, she worked at the most prestigious organization in town, the National Foreign Trade Council, which I used to run, but I didn't have the wisdom to hire Vanessa. That came later. But she was there, and she worked at ECAT, the Emergency Committee for American Trade, prior to that, all on trade and international investment, international economic policies. Previously, she served as a trial attorney with the Department of Justice and as an assistant general counsel with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So we have considerable expertise here and a lot to talk about. The senator put a lot of issues on the table. I know the panel has done its homework and looked at our papers as well. So let me ask you a few questions. We're having to our online audience, we're having some technical issues about getting your online questions, but we will attempt to conquer those. But in the audience, the in-person audience, you'll get your chance. But first, let me ask a few, and let's have a conversation. Let me start with something that we didn't really get to with the senator, which is, in a way, the reason why we're here in the first place, which is lithium-ion batteries are set to become an increasingly important feature of the U.S. energy portfolio. Or are they? Is that the right technology? How confident are you that this particular technology is going to end up being the one most widely adopted? We live in a market-based system. We don't have the government saying everybody's going to have one of those. So the market is going to decide. And has it already decided on lithium-ion, or are there other alternatives out there that might prove better? Our paper actually gets into that, although we don't come to a definitive conclusion. Anybody want to comment?
I'm happy to start. So first of all, I did my homework last night. The Yaley in the audience will appreciate. I got ready for class. The papers are excellent. I mean, I'd read them before, but please don't leave here without checking on the papers, because they're really great and they go into a lot more detail than we can get into in the short time that we have together. But they do talk about this issue, and it's a great question. At the moment, for solar and wind energy generation, we need a storage mechanism because solar and wind are intermittent sources and they don't work at night for the most part. So battery storage is integral to all of our clean energy generation that we do in this country. At the moment, lithium-ion batteries are the battery of choice for energy storage for solar and wind. I suspect that in 10 years there will be multiple choices. And we are actually working with manufacturers right now that are not just in the lithium-ion space, but also other spaces to look at alternatives. At the moment, from a commercial perspective, lithium-ion battery is cheap. It stores energy for quite a long time. It's relatively easy to install in massive quantities, which is how we do our storage at our projects. So it's the battery of choice for sure. But I would point out that not only are we confident there'll be other choices, but the U.S. government is making a significant investment in the R&D area to look at other opportunities. There's a lot of DOE and other money going into exploring other chemistries. So a decade from now, Bill, I would say there'll be multiple choices.
Rory?
Yeah, same. I think for now, lithium-ion batteries are the battery of choice. I mean, they do have problems, especially for electric vehicles. They're heavy. And that's one of the biggest problems with electric vehicles right now is they're heavy and they need to lightweight to get more range. So there's a lot of research going into developing new battery technologies like solid state or sodium ion or whatever it may be. But I'd say for at least the next decade, it's probably the battery of choice for electric vehicles. That includes hybrids and other.
Is
less
Canada
clean.
going in the same direction?
Well, I don't think anyone came here to listen to a trade policy guy opine about lithium-ion batteries versus other types of batteries. But what I will say is where you were, Bill, is the role of government really is to create the ecosystem, right, where private sector can then explore the right kind of technologies at the right time. And I think that's the approach that we're taking in Canada, right? Creating that ecosystem, both through the demand-based side of setting targets for the adoption of ZEVs, but also supporting the battery manufacturers, either through investment tax credits or through contributions to plants, to allow them then to set up the technology, the scale they need then to produce the energy solutions for today, but also for the future.
I think, just to pursue that, make a couple comments of my own. I think one of the things the Senator alluded to when in his opening remarks, which caught my attention, was if you're going to be in the investment game as government, you're going to have some failures. You're going to have you're going to invest in areas that ultimately are not going to be successful. And I think part of the political issues that governments have to face is getting the people to understand that you're not going to have a 100% success rate. The United States has not had a 100% success rate, particularly in solar, where there's a conspicuous example of a lack of success. But if you're going to play that game, you have to be prepared for that and accommodate that in your planning. The other thing that stood out, and in a way this is why I asked the question, is that there was a study done a while back about Chinese investment in China in solar panel development and solar cell development that concluded, among other things, that effectively what the government did is they picked a technology that they thought would be the one that would be most competitive. And maybe it is, but the point was we'll never know, because by putting massive amounts of investment in one place, you starve everybody else. And that means that there were people who may have had better ideas that didn't get funding, and we'll never know if, in a market system, hopefully we avoid that. The other side, of course, is in a market system, you do go down various roads, some of which end up being dead ends. All that said, that leads me kind of to the next question, which is how fast is this moving? I mean, there's an enormous amount of buzz about this every day. There's articles about electric vehicles. The president has responded with tariffs on Chinese EVs, even though there's a minimal amount of them coming into the country at the moment. We're all getting ready, but is this imminent? I mean, one of the points the senator made, I know before we began, actually, when we were chatting about this, but then later, was that some of the conditions in the legislation that provides incentives in the United States, in the Inflation Reduction Act, have content requirements and of various sorts, which may be going into effect faster than the technology is going to be available to take advantage of them. So how big a problem is that? How fast are we moving? When are we going to be all solar and all electric? Sometime between, sometime between 4 years and never, I imagine.
I'm not going to talk about the EV batteries for cars. I'm going to talk about my batteries, and then Rory can take that. Look, my job is incredibly fascinating and incredibly frustrating because, as Bill points out in the papers that are, as I said, I recommend you read, this is a push-me-pull-you situation with the Biden administration. They want us to deploy clean energy at historic rates, and I think our industry is trying desperately to do that. But there are a lot of headwinds that we face constantly that are sort of pushing us in another direction, among them tariffs, of which there are many. In case you don't know, there's a lot of tariffs that affect clean energy deployment, principally on solar products, and also to some extent on batteries. So the answer is, this is incredibly complicated. I mean, we represent manufacturers, and my companies would be so happy to buy American completely. That would make them incredibly happy, and it would avoid the tariff risk that they have to sort of mitigate right now. The reality is it takes time to build manufacturing in the United States. We're really not great at permitting manufacturing facilities. We don't have great workforce training that makes manufacturing jobs look attractive to young people. In fact, I would argue that many young people would not see that as an option that they would look for. They would see that as sort of a downgrade from what their college education and other things prepared them for. And we're not good at balancing trade policy and domestic production needs. I mean, we understand why domestic producers want protection, totally understand that, but you have to have some way of gauging that against sort of imports. There's no way, we do this all the time, we do modeling to see when domestic energy storage battery production will meet deployment requirements. Like where do those two curves cross? And at the moment, they cross around 2027. So that tells me that we're going to need to import batteries while we're building factories that make batteries, and that those two streams are going to have to continue until such point as we really can meet domestic demand by U.S. production. And we probably will get there because the demand is going to be, there's going to be a huge demand driver for lithium-ion batteries in the short term because, as we point out, Bill, that's the, for the moment, that is the market choice. So, will we get there? Probably. But, that's a long time when you're trying to figure out, that's a lot of planning to do. And it's hard work. So, that's the challenge. And that's, I think, what the Biden administration has been struggling with.
In the automotive space, it's moving very quickly. My 12 companies have announced close to $40 billion in investment over the past 2 years. And that's all into battery manufacturing, into upgrading plants to make electric vehicles. The headwind side is we do have these content requirements. We don't have domestic production. There's not a lot of production outside of China, especially when you take into consider processing. And they just made that all more expensive with the tariffs. And everyone's trying to de-risk from China. Everyone's trying to move supply chains out. But until you can, we've got to keep moving toward getting electric vehicles more affordable for the consumer. And if you're going to increase costs into the inputs to produce vehicles, that becomes more difficult. And until production's online here, it's got to come from somewhere.
There's more growing discussion about problems on the demand side, more problems on the demand side than the supply side. What are you doing to stimulate demand?
Automakers are offering more incentives these days. There's been a market shift toward deploying fewer purely electric vehicles and moving to more hybrid vehicles as consumers are still struggling with kind of range anxiety and infrastructure and charging issues. We've seen, I think plug-in hybrids are one of the hardest vehicles to get right now. They don't stay on lots for more than 10 days at this point. I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like that. So there's efforts to get vehicles to be cleaner, but there's still a bunch of headwinds between, permitting, getting mines online, getting processing online, between getting charging infrastructure installed. There's just lots of things that need to happen, and a lot of them are chicken and egg problems. You need to have a demand for electric vehicles, but you also need to solve these problems that consumers are worried about.
Well, I think just from an international trade policy perspective, but also from a North American perspective, these are the kind of questions that both Canada and the United States are trying to address, in their own ways. And I think, if we can build off what the senator was talking about, doing his great infomercials for Canada, we have the opportunity to work together collaboratively in this space, right? In terms of critical mineral exploration, making sure that those supply chains are resilient, robust. I think we look at the base of, for example, the USMCA. We have that agreement that's built into the relationship, right? And how can we use that agreement as a way to continue to build not only our economic security in this space, but also our national securities? And I think that's an interesting conversation that we're going to have in the future as we look at the transition to the electric vehicle future.
I think we're going to have it next year, or 2 years now.
Yeah.
2026, big year for USMCA.
It is a very big year, absolutely.
One of the points the senator made several times was that a big, or if not the biggest problem was permitting and the time it takes on shore to develop new capabilities. For Rory and Vanessa, is he right about that?
No, totally right. In fact, one of our legislative priorities this year is permitting, and for us it crosses it's not just mining and risk extracting, it's across entire projects. We're not, across all our clean energy projects, we have these issues all the time. Everything is complicated when you're talking about clean energy because permitting is the delay. That is, for us, the government delay in almost everything. And that's transmission lines, solar fields, wind towers. It's across all clean energy we have issues. So it was interesting to hear him talk about how intense the conversations are. I think that's true. I think Manchin and Baraska are having, and they're having really intense conversations. The problem is just everybody wants everything to be in the bill across multiple technologies, by the way, including oil and gas bill. So it gets complicated, right? Because you have to think about how are you going to do this permitting in a way that's, crosses all these different types of energy generation, and oil and gas people want their fair share of that discussion as well, which, is probably a fair ask at this point. But politics are complicated.
And permitting affects even charging sites. I mean, where to place electric vehicle chargers, how to get electricity to those chargers. I mean, permitting plays into all of that as well.
So is the senator right that Canada has solved this problem?
I don't know that we've solved it, but we're certainly working towards addressing it. I think earlier this year, our Minister of Natural Resources announced the fact that we would look to bring our average timelines down from about 15 years to about 5. As it's quite an ambitious target to reach. It's going to require, obviously, the support and interplay of the provincial and federal level, as well as our stakeholders. I mean, in Canada, one of the major considerations, of course, is who owns the land. Indigenous rights is incredibly important for Canada. So we have a long way to go, but we've made a commitment to reducing it, and we'll see how successful we are in the years to come.
Let me, at least for Carlos, let me turn to actually a trade question, which I'm sure you've been waiting for. One of the themes here of the paper and the conversation with Senator Langford was the need for the United States to involve our friends and allies to diversify away from China while accelerating the green transition. I'd like, can we get your assessment from a Canadian perspective, first of how that's going, how it's going for you, presumably with the same goal, and for us, and in particular, what do you think our current Biden administration policy gaps in building cooperation with friends and allies?
Well, look, I think one of the hallmarks of the Canada-U.S. relationship is that we cooperate very closely across, don't tell you the range of issues, but especially in the transition towards, a greener future. Both the Biden administration as well as the current federal government in Canada have made no bones, no secrets about how important this is and how central it is to their policies. And you're starting to see, that this cooperation be exhibited in very tangible ways. Just in late May, in fact, there was a joint funding announcement between the United States and Canada into critical mineral exploration, where the U.S. actually invested into Canadian mining outfits looking to exploit potential Canadian resources. I think that's a very tangible example of how we do this sort of on a daily basis as cooperation. Is there room for improvement, room for greater cooperation? Absolutely. The Senator was talking about, friendshoring. Colleagues here talking about the need for imports and how domestic content restrictions can sometimes be a hindrance. As a Canadian trade policy official, we are always hyper aware about domestic content requirements in the United States and how that may affect cross-border trade, but also how they may affect our joint ability to achieve the kind of things that we're looking to achieve. In fact, I think in Politico this morning, there were articles about how some of the administration's policies were having a negative impact on their ability to achieve the green transition.
Is Canada pursuing nearshoring or friendshoring relationships with other countries?
Well, when you have roughly 8% of your trade going to one country, you know where you need to concentrate on. But I will say, Canada continues to pursue a fairly robust free trade relationship negotiations around the world. Obviously, we're still part of the CPTPP, where the UK is joining.
Yes, good on you for that. We are deficient.
But we are also speaking with ASEAN and other groups of countries. So we see that network of free trade agreements as being vital to not only our national security but also our economic security going forward.
Rory, let's talk about cars and batteries and the IRA for a minute. The administration has championed policy tools, mostly tax credits, in the IRA, intended to accelerate EV deployment, while at the same time putting in a bunch of guardrails around what kinds of vehicles are eligible for the incentives, particularly conditions on batteries, parts and components, and the source of batteries, mainly not China. Can you speak to the extent to which there's a contradiction between the two policies there, incentives on the one hand and limitations on the other? How is that affecting electric vehicle production and deployment?
I mean, yeah, it's the standards in the IRA, especially for the 30D consumer tax credit, are ambitious and difficult to meet. I mean, when you have, content requirements for the minerals that go into batteries and foreign entity of concern requirements that exclude China, when you don't have a lot of domestic capacity for those minerals, and everyone but FTA partners are cut out, it really limits your choices of where you can source from, which is why we've been advocating heavily for these critical minerals agreements, so we can get more diversification away from China to source minerals outside. And then you layer in on top now new tariffs that are going to go on to graphite and other materials needed for battery production here. You're making all those inputs more expensive, which is going to drive up the cost of EVs. And then you layer on top of that, the EPA mandates by 60% of all vehicles sold in the U.S. are going to have to be electric by 2031. There's just things that don't line up here. You're not going to, without lots more material coming in and lots more sources of battery components and vehicles even for qualifying, there's just a misalignment between cost of vehicle, cost of batteries, and production of the inputs that go into it.
And what's the result? Simply a slower transition?
Slower transition, higher cost of vehicles, yeah.
Has anybody done any studies of, if there were no limitations in the bill at all, how that would affect the price of an average EV?
It's a difficult one to map out, given all the different things between, like we've mentioned, charging infrastructure, permitting, consumer comfortableness with range and where they're going to charge. I mean, it's a difficult projection to make, but it would certainly be easier the faster we can get the cost of vehicles, to that below $30,000 mark, which is kind of where you get mass deployment.
Are you worried about Chinese imports?
The vast scale they have is concerning, especially for markets outside the U.S. Just the displacement of legacy car makers is a concern. I mean, and when you have subsidies in the scale that China has provided to the entire supply chain from mine to finished vehicle, it's difficult to know how to compete when you don't have similar subsidies elsewhere. So it's a concern. Probably not so much for the U.S. market. It's a deeply competitive market here. I think there's 17 companies in the U.S. right now building vehicles. But it's
got
around
to be
the
a
world.
concern for your members because they're global.
Yeah, exactly.
And how are they dealing with the challenge in other places?
I don't have a good sense of how they're dealing with it. In the EU, I think they're finalizing their investigation into Chinese EV subsidies tomorrow.
I thought due out the 4th of July, I think officially.
Yeah, I've heard the preliminary is going to come in tomorrow, so we'll learn what they're doing there. But there's, it's concerning worldwide.
Okay, Vanessa, a subject that I know is near and dear to your heart, which is how the administration's emphasis on reshoring in the solar and wind sector, solar in particular, will help. Excuse me. Will help address the country's current production capabilities. What challenges does the domestic manufacturing industry face with respect to sort of homegrown lithium-ion batteries and the entire supply chain that creates them?
Well, the good news is we have IRA, and I think if you look at we have a website that has a page called Investing in America, where we track announcements, and actually not just announcements, but things that people who are actually building facilities and building components for clean energy. And the good news is there's a lot of interest and a lot of shovels in the ground to build solar module manufacturing facilities. We'll even be making cells within a few years. Battery manufacturing is starting. We'll be making cells down the road. Cell manufacture for both technologies is just harder and more expensive than actual assembly. So the good news is we've got a lot of committed investors. Many of them are foreign investors that are making a big investment in America. Korean, Japanese, many allied powers, Canadians, others who are coming here and deciding to make a bet in the US market. The problem is, there's a lot of cheap available solar and batteries out in the world, and those companies have to compete. I will say they're getting a lot of help from tariffs. So, the tariff policy the Biden administration has chosen to embrace, and I would include in tariffs anti-dumping and countervailing duty. That's not driven by the White House, but it's driven by the law that is sort of run by the Commerce Department. It provides a lot of protections, and we're having some real, roll up your sleeves arguments about where the balance should be struck in terms of, do you put a tariff on batteries now? Do you put a tariff on batteries later? A good example is the 301 announcement that came out recently did have a benefit from my industry, not Ferraris. When the tariff was changed on finished batteries, it went immediately up on August 1st. It will go up for the car ones, and mine have a year and a half before the tariff goes up for energy storage batteries. So we have a little bit of a window there to sort of use that ramp to get domestic manufacturing up and running. I think that the bottom line is, Bill, that the companies that I talk to that are investing in these U.S. manufacturing projects are investing for the long run. They see the demand driver for solar and wind is incredibly strong, and they're building for that future. And they understand that the market's going to be challenging for the next couple of years with imports, but they're committed to the U.S. market.
Is a year and a
Same
half.
for EVs as well. Just, our analysis is that, U.S. EV battery production will probably meet demand somewhere around 27, 28. And so the fact that tariffs went onto batteries immediately was kind of shocking, that they wouldn't provide that same flexibility on that ramp up.
Is the flexibility that Vanessa described that is benefiting her guys, is that enough time?
Well, we told them it was. So I hope
Did you tell them the truth?
Well, we're data-driven.
But wait a minute, they actually asked you how long it would take?
They actually did ask us to give the Biden administration credit, give them credit. We did have a conversation about this, yes. A very robust, data-driven conversation, to be fair. And it was about this exact issue. When will domestic manufacturing, when will the curves meet, right? Just as an economist, if you had two curves, when will they meet? And we think today that they'll meet in 2027. They gave us January 1st, 2026, because there's a political element to this, but that's better than August 1st, 2024, which is what Rory got. So I think we got a benefit there that the EV people did not get, which we're very appreciative of, so.
And you think it will accelerate ongoing efforts because it's a little bit shorter than what you wanted?
I think that's what the White House thinks. Do I think that people will build their factories faster? It's hard to build batteries fast. I mean, manufacturing is just complicated, right? As I said, you've got permitting, you've got workforce, you've got to make sure inputs are priced right. So, we'll see. We told them what we thought. They gave us a date. We'll see if that, the data will win. We'll see what happens in a year and a half. So talk to me then, and we'll see.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the permitting issue. The senator didn't bite when I was asking about the GAO report that suggested funding and staffing was the problem. He seemed to suggest if you just rearrange the deck chairs in the agency, you'll solve the problem.
Well, he did have one comment that I think was very true, which is one of the things we've been pushing for is one-stop shopping. So one of the problems, and I'm sure this is not unique to the United States, if you have 5 agencies that have to opine on something, the chances that they're going to do a good job interagency coordinating, with all due respect to our friends in the government, it's hard, right? So what we've been pushing for, and I think some of the permitting legislation on the Hill tries to get to this point, is sort of one place to go where we have basically have someone who can Sherpa your permit through, Bill. Like you can imagine how that would work, right? So one place that's centralized where people can go and get answers and get a timeline, and that person is sort of invested in moving the process along. It's just some way to break the interagency gridlock, which sadly in this area there's more than the usual amount, I would say.
Is this what you do?
Well, I mean, as a civil servant, I have to defend, our interagency processes and no, of course, there's always gridlock. No, I mean, look, I think part of the aim or the ability to speed up our permitting process will be to break down some of these silos and to have these conversations, again, not just between federal entities, but also within provincial and even local entities. Instead of having a sequential process, have it sort of happen simultaneously to the extent possible, right? So that people aren't waiting for one step to stop before the next one can start.
Exactly, yeah.
I think that's going to help speed up everything.
Well, let me say to our online audience, our technology may actually be working. So if you have an online question, click on the button and send it in, and in theory, it will show up right here in my lap. And in-person audience, we're going to turn to you in just a minute for questions as well. But I've got one more for all of you to opine on. And that's reflecting what we do here in the Scholl Chair, which is it's called the Scholl Chair in International Business for a reason. And one of the things we do is study how trade tools can be part of a business solution to the policy challenges and economic challenges that they face. I think, as I think the senator alluded to, we're expecting a lot of drama, but not a lot of action on the trade front over the next, between now and the election, over the next 4 or 5 months. Although there's always the lame duck session, which appears to be inevitable as a possibility. But we can always hope that after the election, a constructive trade agenda will again become part of the solution on some of the things that we're talking about. How does that matter does the trade policy action matter very much anymore from a lithium-ion battery supply chain perspective, or is the die really already cast and now it's just all about implementation?
Oh, I think it matters a lot. So the manufacturers in my space who are making energy storage lithium-ion batteries, they will be honest with you, they are assembling the batteries, they do not have all the inputs that they need, and they will not be able to get them. With all due respect to everybody who is hopeful that we are mining in great amounts soon, and I hope that's true, but the reality is in the short term, lithium, graphite, our batteries are largely lithium iron phosphate, so you need iron, you need graphite, you need lithium, large amounts of this. So the people who are manufacturing are trying to lock up supply as best they can. No one in my industry wants to get things from China for various reasons. Geopolitical, forced labor, lots of complications using Chinese sources, so people are looking for other sources. And it would be great if we had a trade policy where our government was negotiating with other governments to make that easier. And I don't think that's happening, and I'm you're just preaching to the choir. I was at USTR in the days of a robust trade agreements agenda, and I hope for the agency it gets back to that.
I have to agree with everything Vanessa said. I think it's very important. I mean, especially when you're thinking about the IRA tax incentives, one of the provisions was North America or free trade agreement partners. I mean, we only have 21 agreements in the U.S., and many of those don't have production of batteries or electric vehicles or anything of the sort. And if we're going to get anywhere near the 2031 mandate for clean vehicles, I mean, there's just not enough inputs, in the U.S. and probably not in North America unless we really scale up really fast. And as we've discussed at length already, is permitting's not on the table to get that done.
Carlos, do you think this is going to be a big issue in the USMCA review in 2026?
Well, look, I think the USMCA review is still, 2 years in the future. We're obviously starting to think about it quite clearly, but we've got the U.S. election to go through. We've got our own election to go through before we get to 2026. So I hesitate to talking about specifics so far out. But clearly, I think, in the environment that we're in, why do we have FTAs are all about, they send a signal to the market that, these groups of countries, two countries, are friends, and that they share similar values, be it democratic, be it economic, and it's that business certainty. That certainty then falls to the business community, so we make investment decisions and production plans, and that's what we really see as the enduring value of the USMCA. And in this environment that we're in, where we have malign actors in the world, where we have unreliable supply chains, where we have things like forced labor, how can we look at what we have already to both safeguard that, but also think and ask ourselves the question, how can we use these agreements to not only bolster our economic security, but as a tool to bolster our broader national security? So I think that's the lens through which 2026 will be focused on.
Can I just jump in and say, just keep in mind that two of the biggest issues on the agenda in 2026 will be energy, where the U.S. has very grave concerns, as does Canada, about the Mexican policy that the exiting president has followed on energy, the way he treats foreign investors, and on cars. there's an autos agreement, there's an auto panel that never was implemented, right?
Yep.
And we all know how complicated that's gonna be. And just those two things alone, Bill, if that's on the table for 2026, you've already got a robust agenda to start a conversation that does touch on these things.
Yeah.
And I can tell you right now, the US government has started thinking about 2026
They-
and about this important moment in time where we look at USMCA and ask ourselves, are we going to keep it in place? I hope the answer is yes. And how can we make it a better agreement for North America? And I think everyone needs to keep their eye on that.
They certainly have. And remember, I mean, the automotive rules of origin was probably one of the biggest changes that was made from NAFTA to USMCA. And that is certainly going to be on the table again, no matter who wins the election. And, there's already a lot of rumors swirling about Chinese restrictions to the rules of origin, raising
Mexico backdoor, there's all
Mexico,
those,
there's lots
all those
of
questions, right?
lots of
They all
questions
come into
that are
the
going to
same
be
discussion.
make it not an easy discussion, I think.
Well, let's turn to the audience in the remaining time. Oh my goodness, there's a bunch of questions. Evan, how about third row here with the gentleman with the...
Hi, my name is Poria. I'm with the Embassy of the Netherlands, and I have a question for Vanessa. So how seriously are the companies that you work with looking into investing in domestic recycling capacity?
Very seriously, super complicated, it turns out. I think to myself, when I put the recycling out every week, like, this can't be that complicated, right? You put the recycling in, it goes somewhere. The biggest issue with batteries, it turns out, is getting consumers to take them somewhere to be recycled. Because we are honestly a country that is used to throwing batteries away. And I know this is an issue for EVs, it's gonna be an issue for my companies as well. The idea of seeing the end of life of these batteries and then getting them somewhere where they can be taking them, physically getting them delivered somewhere they can be recycled, incentivizing people to do that, and then coming up with the companies that can actually engage in the kind of recycling that we need to extract what they can. I think it's critically important. We have a whole work stream dedicated to it, but commercially, in my space, we're still struggling to see how it's going to actually happen in practice.
And in the automotive space, I mean, which turns out that EV batteries are lasting longer than people thought. And so, when is the recycling capacity going to get there?
And who's going to do it?
And who's going to do it?
The dealer's going to then take it somewhere. How are you going to get consumers to do this?
Yeah.
And it's a big issue for consumer behavior. That is what people tell me.
But I do know that some of the battery makers in the U.S. are setting agreements with like Redwood's Recycling and Life Cycle for offtake agreements for the recycled material. But it's it's still such a small percentage of what actually goes into the manufacturing process at this point.
Okay, here on the side of the aisle. Yes.
Hi, my name's Chris Dale. I'm the chairman of an Australian battery materials company in the silicon carbon anode space, who's looking not only to friendshore, but onshore in the US. I'm also a recovering government career official. So I say this, this is a very Washington conversation. Our biggest challenge in building a manufacturing facility in the United States is not permitting, it's not trade policy, it's finance. Like every startup, we have to get from a good idea to offtake. Mm-hmm. And I think that element of this conversation, that was missing from this conversation. I think that I don't have the answers, but more innovative policies that encourage venture capitalists, hedge funds, whoever, to invest in these spaces is actually a missing piece of the U.S. government approach at this point.
So I'll just make a quick response. So I know what we see in our space is there is a DOE, there's some loans available and some grants and such, obviously you're aware of those. I think DOE is trying to figure out how to do that better. The problem is government's not really good at commercial relationships, right? So you don't necessarily want the heavy hand of government in those relationships. On the other hand, I take your point, people need support, people need some help when they're getting off the ground with the new technology. I think we're still figuring that out. DOE is growing that space. They have a whole new office that's dedicated to this concept of manufacturing and supporting it. So that's a positive development. I think we just have to, sort of make sure that stays in the trends in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, it's government needs to be making sure that those investments are secure. I mean, that's maybe not have a hand in the investment, but make sure the policies are in place that investors like yourself or others feel secure in making those investments, and that they're going to be profitable in the future.
Okay, woman here in second to last row.
Hi, I'm Anna Ashton. My company is Ashton Analytics, and I'm wondering if you can comment on the pluses and minuses of Chinese licensing agreements, joint ventures, foreign direct investment in the United States in this space, such as the, on-again, off-again CATL4 deal or the Goshen investment.
So easy, Anna. Don't say Anna asked the hard question. She's a China expert. Wow, I gotta be careful here. We're really trying to figure this out, Anna. We're painfully aware that it's unlikely the U.S. is going to be able to move forward with our renewable energy goals without Chinese licensing. The reality is the Chinese have the best machinery for making solar, they have the best technology for making solar, they have the best battery technology. So, I think it's almost inevitable that there's got to be some balance. The question is where to draw the line. And I don't think it's, not one molecule of Chinese anything, and I don't think it's all Chinese. I mean, it's got to be somewhere in the middle. But it's constant conversation we're having, and I will say, what's making it challenging is there's a lot of legislative ideas out there that are just wacky, and we're trying to figure out, we're willing to work with Congress, but we got to figure out. I'm talking to Ways and Means on Friday about this. Where is the line drawn? What is an acceptable level of Chinese involvement, for example, versus what do we feel is too much involvement? Last comment I'll make on this, I think Americans are really good at innovating on the factory floor. If we can get even last year's model from the Chinese, I tell people all the time, when you buy machines from the Chinese for solar, they don't sell you their model that's in the shop. They say there's stuff in the back. Because they're like, the Americans will give them the old model. And that's fine, honestly, because we're really good at innovating. And if we can just sort of start with something that's already pretty good, we can probably make it better. The challenge will be then to keep the innovations here. I think we've learned our lesson over the last 2 decades, but to try to innovate and then keep the innovation in a way that's shared only with our trusted partners and isn't sort of given to the world.
That's actually ironic, because that's been our export control policy with respect to China. It's been the same thing. All right, next question in front of the previous question, and then we'll come over to the other side.
Hi, I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I was just curious to hear about your thoughts on how businesses are responding to supply chain risks in China and whether they're willing to collaborate with government on creating domestic mining and processing facilities.
I don't have any good insight into that too.
Yeah, we're not, the mining piece,
Yeah.
for us, we're not really the people to talk to.
Yeah,
The
unfortunately.
National Mining Association has lots of thoughts. I think the reality is, people are willing to, on our side of for inputs, we'd love to get U.S. source. It's a question of how quickly they can come online.
I think that's the NIMBY issue that comes
It is
up
indeed.
very much.
Yeah. That's why Senator Langford was talking about brownfields.
That was an ingenious approach. He mentioned the North Carolina case, which is an interesting one because it's apparently a fairly large lithium deposit, which is next door to a state park.
Oh.
And, inevitably, if there's an effort to exploit it, which I think has not occurred yet, at least in that case, there will be people coming and say you can't do that because of various neighborhood,
Mining
environmental
technology.
reasons.
It's true.
And as I said earlier, in America, anybody can sue anybody for anything, and so you immediately get into a litigation path here. And this is why, this is why it takes so long to get anything out of the ground here. The average, the Senator mentioned a range of, I think, something between 14 and 20 years or something. The average in a mining operation from discovery of the deposit, whatever it is, to production in the United States is 16 years, which is a very long time and a problem that we need to wrestle with. There's a question over here. Yes.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. I'll give you a real easy one, Rory. I wanted to ask about the commerce investigation into connected vehicles. Y'all kind of touched on this with the idea of, are there going to be restrictions on Chinese parts or production in Mexico? But of course, we have Volvo and soon to have Polestar in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So are folks thinking about, is there a risk that the Commerce Department is going to say those factories are going to have to shut down? Or is there going to be a way where those American jobs can be preserved, but they won't be able to use Chinese software?
That investigation is still very early, so it's hard to say. I think production in the U.S. is safe. The real question is, what's going to happen to the supply chains where there's no other options for things that make connected vehicles possible. Depending on how it's implemented, it could be very disruptive to the entire industry, not just the companies you mentioned in South Carolina. So it's still early. My association, we provided some ideas on maybe to set some sort of secure supply chain vetting process up that can make sure that there's no national security risks here. But it's, like I said, it's still very early.
Okay, that appears to be the last question, which is convenient because we're over time. Thank you to the audience for your patience. Thank you to the panel for, I think, a very enlightening discussion and a good follow-up to the senator's comments. And we appreciate your coming. And everybody, get the papers, all three of them, and take a look at them. I think it's worth it. Thank you very much.